December 9th, 1945, 11:45 hours. A desolate industrial road outside Mannheim, Germany. The most dangerous man the Allies ever produced is sitting in the back of a 1938 Cadillac Model 75, completely unaware that his war is about to end in a way no battlefield could accomplish. In 60 seconds, everything will change. General George Patton Jr. leans back against cream-colored leather upholstery, his jaw set in that familiar expression of controlled impatience. Outside, the German winter cuts through skeletal trees. The sky hangs low and gray, suffocating. Frost clings to shattered factory windows. This is occupied territory, but it feels like a graveyard. 7 months since Germany's surrender. 7 months since the tanks stopped rolling. 7 months of watching politicians hand Eastern Europe to Stalin like a gift-wrapped catastrophe. Beside him sits Major General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff, a man who has followed Patton through 3 years of blood and glory. They're heading to a pheasant hunt, a gentleman's Sunday diversion. Except tomorrow morning at 0600, Patton is scheduled to board a C-54 transport to Boston. Home, freedom, the chance to finally speak without army censors silencing every word. Private Horace Woodring, 19 years old and terrified of disappointing the general, keeps the Cadillac steady at 30 miles per hour. His hands grip the wheel, his eyes scan the road. Everything is routine. Everything is safe. Then a 2.5-ton GMC truck appears from nowhere. Sergeant Thompson behind the wheel. No warning, no brake lights. The truck lurches left, cutting directly across the Cadillac's path like a matador's cape sweeping before a bull. Woodring's boot slams the brake pedal. Tires scream against asphalt. The laws of physics take over. Metal meets metal at the exact wrong angle. The impact sounds like thunder contained in a steel drum. The Cadillac's front grille crumples, glass explodes. Patton, seated in the back without a seatbelt, becomes a projectile. His body launches forward. His forehead strikes the steel and glass partition separating driver from passenger with enough force to shatter bone. But it's not his skull that breaks, it's his neck. The third cervical vertebra fractures cleanly. The third and fourth vertebrae dislocate. The spinal cord, that fragile highway of human movement, severs its connection to everything below. In 1/10 of a second, the man who commanded armies across France, who liberated concentration camps, who terrified German generals into sleepless nights, loses the ability to move his fingers. Patton collapses into Gay's lap. His eyes are open. His mind is perfectly clear. Terror floods through him. Not the terror of combat, but the terror of a warrior who suddenly understands his body has become a prison. "Rub my fingers, Hap," Patton says, his voice steadied despite the horror blooming in his chest. Gay obeys, massaging Patton's right hand with desperate vigor. Patton stares down at his own flesh, willing sensation to return. Nothing. Absolute silence from the nervous system. He tries the left hand. Nothing. "Go ahead, work them," Patton orders, as if commanding tissue and nerve will restore function through sheer willpower. Gay rubs harder. Patton feels nothing. Not pressure, not warmth, not existence itself. 3 years dodging artillery shells, surviving Stuka dive bombers, leading armored columns through hell, and now this, a car accident on a quiet Sunday morning. The universe's cruelest joke. "I'm paralyzed," Patton says. The words emerge, flat, factual. This is a hell of a way to die. Gay's face drains white. Woodring stumbles from the driver's seat, uninjured, in shock. The truck driver climbs down from his cab, also unscathed. The two vehicles sit mangled together, steam rising from crushed radiators. But somehow, impossibly, Patton is the only casualty.
not a scratch on anyone else, just the general broken in the back seat. Within 4 minutes, something impossible begins happening. High-ranking officers arrive, not military police, not medics, senior commanders, men with stars on their collars appear on this remote industrial road like ghosts materializing from cigarette smoke. It's Sunday morning in occupied Germany. How did they know? Who called them? The radios in 1945 didn't work that fast. Communications protocols required routing through channels. Yet here they stand, surrounding the Cadillac, faces grim, mouths silent. Lieutenant Peter Babalas of the military police arrives to document the scene. He takes photographs, he measures skid marks, he interviews witnesses, he files an official accident report with meticulous detail, everything the regulations demand. The report enters the Army's bureaucratic machinery and vanishes like smoke. Decades later, Babalas will request a copy of his own report. The Army will tell him it doesn't exist. No record, no file, no evidence that anyone ever documented the accident that killed America's most famous general. But before the missing reports, before the vanished witnesses, before the questions that will haunt investigators for 78 years, there is only Patton lying motionless in Gay's arms, watching his war end in the most undignified way imaginable. They load him into an ambulance, not to the hospital in Mannheim 3 miles away, not to the closest medical facility equipped for trauma. Instead, the ambulance races 12 miles to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, jarring Patton's broken vertebrae with every pothole and turn. No one explains why, no one questions the route. The 130th Station Hospital smells like carbolic acid and failure. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. Nurses move through corridors with practiced efficiency, their faces carefully neutral. They've seen broken men before, thousands of them, but George Patton isn't supposed to be one of them.
Doctors perform examinations with hands that try not to shake. X-rays reveal the damage. Third cervical vertebra fractured. Third and fourth vertebrae dislocated. Spinal cord compressed. Paralysis from the neck down, complete and total. The man who once stood in his tank turret firing a machine gun at Luftwaffe fighters now cannot wiggle his toes. They place him in traction, 15 pounds of weight attached to a head halter, pulling his skull away from his spine, trying to create space for healing that may never come. Patton lies flat on his back, staring at acoustic tiles, unable to move anything except his eyes and mouth. His wife, Beatrice, arrives from Boston 3 days later. She reads to him every afternoon, poetry, newspapers, letters from soldiers who owe him their lives. Her voice fills the silence between medical procedures and morphine doses. Patton jokes with visitors, his dark humor intact even as his body deteriorates. "Relax, gentlemen," he tells staff officers who stand awkwardly at his bedside. "I'm in no condition to be a terror now." But beneath the gallows humor, Patton knows. He's made too many enemies, said too many dangerous truths. For months before the accident, Patton had been a problem, not a military problem, a political one. While Eisenhower and Truman celebrated victory in Europe, Patton stood in occupied Germany, watching the Soviets swallow nations whole. He watched Polish resistance fighters abandoned. He watched Churchill's warnings ignored. He watched Stalin's tanks roll into Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and he understood with perfect clarity what was happening. The Allies had defeated one totalitarian empire only to hand Eastern Europe to another. Patton said so, publicly, repeatedly, loudly. In June 1945, while the victory parades were still being planned, Patton told reporters that the Soviet Union represented a synthesis of all that is evil. He suggested that the United States should rearm the German army and drive the Russians back to Moscow while American forces were still intact in Europe.
He called the denazification program a disaster, arguing that Germany needed strong leaders to rebuild, not bureaucratic witch hunts. Every statement was logged. Every interview was monitored. His telephone conversations were tapped. OSS operatives followed his movements. Reports landed on desks in Washington with alarming frequency. Patton is becoming uncontrollable. Patton is undermining Allied unity. Patton must be silenced. Eisenhower stripped him of Third Army Command in October, reassigning him to a meaningless position overseeing historical records, a desk job, a humiliation designed to send a message. But Patton planned to return to America and tell his story anyway. He intended to write memoirs, testify before Congress, perhaps run for political office. The thought terrified people in very high places. A dead Patton couldn't write memoirs. If you've made it this far into this story, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. The past isn't just dates and battles, it's mystery, conspiracy, and questions that powerful people never wanted asked. Let me know where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like so we can keep digging into the stories they tried to bury. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. December 10th through December 20th blur together in Patton's hospital room. Doctors administer treatment, nurses check vitals, Beatrice reads. Visitors come and go, their faces carefully composed masks of optimism. By December 18th, Patton's condition stabilizes. The swelling in his spinal cord decreases. Doctors whisper cautiously hopeful predictions. He might regain some arm function. He'll never walk again, but he'll survive. Transfer to the United States becomes possible. Walter Reed Hospital, specialized rehabilitation, a future as a paraplegic, but a future nonetheless. Then December 21st arrives. Patton wakes that morning with absolute certainty. He tells a nurse, almost casually, as if discussing the weather, "I'm going to die today." The nurse smiles, dismisses it as morphine talking. But Patton isn't joking, isn't confused. He knows. At 17:30 hours, Beatrice leaves for dinner, the hospital cafeteria, 30 minutes away from his bedside. She kisses his forehead, promises to return soon. At 17:55 hours, George Patton's heart stops. Nurses rush in. Doctors attempt resuscitation, adrenaline, chest compressions, desperate procedures that accomplish nothing. At 17:55 hours on December 21st, 1945, the most dangerous man the Allies ever produced is declared dead. Official cause, pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure. A blood clot traveled from his immobile legs to his heart. Tragic, unfortunate, not uncommon in paralysis patients. The paperwork is filed. The case is closed. Beatrice refuses an autopsy. The Army requests one, standard procedure for a general officer. She declines. Some historians claim she was satisfied with the official explanation that everything possible had been done. Others suggest she was protecting something. Without an autopsy, the truth about what killed George Patton dies with him. October 1979, Washington, D.C. The Hilton Hotel ballroom fills with 450 former OSS operatives, the spies and saboteurs who operated in Hitler's shadow. They gather to remember old wars, old missions, old secrets that will follow them to graves. One man stands to speak. Douglas Bazata, decorated combat veteran, Navy Cross recipient, 4 Purple Hearts, French Croix de Guerre, OSS operative trained in assassination, sabotage, psychological warfare, a man who killed enemies of the United States for money and duty. He has something to confess. "I know who killed Patton," Bazata announces to the stunned room. Silence, absolute, the kind that follows grenades in enclosed spaces. $10,000, Bazata continues, his voice steady. General William Donovan himself, Wild Bill, director of the OSS, entrusted me with the mission. I set up the accident. According to Bazata's account, the truck collision was staged. Sergeant Thompson, the driver, was part of the operation. The timing, the angle, the intersection, all carefully orchestrated. But the collision was only meant to create chaos, confusion, the cover for what happened next. As officers swarmed the scene, as witnesses focused on the wrecked vehicles, Bezata fired a specialized low-velocity projectile into Patton's neck. OSS Research and Development had created weapons designed to kill without leaving obvious bullet wounds. The projectile was meant to sever the spinal cord and cause immediate death. It failed. Patton survived with paralysis instead of a corpse. The mission became incomplete, unacceptable.
So, a backup plan activated. Bezata claimed that an NKVD agent, a Soviet assassin working in collaboration with American intelligence, entered Patton's hospital room on December 21st and administered a dose of cyanide designed to cause cardiac arrest and embolism. Untraceable, perfectly timed, murder disguised as natural causes from injuries sustained in an accident. The audience sat frozen. Some thought Bezata had lost his mind. Others remembered that Bezata was many things, but never a liar. He maintained his confession until his death in 1999. He was never charged with any crime. His claims were never proven, never definitively disproven. No document has ever surfaced confirming Bezata's claim, and intelligence agencies have denied it ever since. Just left hanging in historical purgatory alongside the missing accident reports, the vanished truck driver, the refused autopsy, and the impossible timing of high-ranking officers arriving at a remote crash scene. Consider the geopolitical chessboard in December 1945. Stalin controlled Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Adriatic. The Red Army occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Eastern Germany with no intention of withdrawing. Churchill had already warned of an Iron Curtain descending across the continent. Truman was trying to maintain the wartime alliance while secretly understanding it was collapsing. And George Patton was preparing to return to America and tell 70 million citizens that their leaders had betrayed Eastern Europe, that Roosevelt's Yalta agreements were catastrophic, that Stalin should have been opposed, not appeased, that the war ended with the wrong victory. He was right. Within 3 years, everything Patton predicted came true. The Iron Curtain fell exactly where he said it would. The Cold War began exactly as he warned. Eastern Europe disappeared behind Soviet occupation for 45 years. The man who saw it coming became the inconvenient prophet who had to be silenced. Who gave the order? We don't know. Bezata claimed Donovan, but Donovan answered to Truman, and Truman was under pressure from Stalin, and Eisenhower wanted Patton gone before he caused a diplomatic incident, and the British intelligence wanted American policy aligned with Churchill's pragmatism, and the NKVD wanted the most aggressive anti-Soviet voice in the American military eliminated. Maybe it was conspiracy, maybe it was convergent interests, maybe it was half a dozen different agendas colliding into one dead general. Or maybe it was just a truck driver who made a mistake on a Sunday morning. 78 years later, the evidence remains circumstantial but disturbing. The accident report disappeared from Army archives. Lieutenant Babalis, who filed it, spent decades trying to retrieve his own documentation. Every request was denied. Every inquiry was met with bureaucratic silence. The single most important piece of physical evidence simply doesn't exist in official records. Sergeant Robert Thompson, the truck driver, was flown to England immediately after the accident for his own protection. 4 days later, he mysteriously reappeared in Germany to give one interview to Army investigators, then vanished again. His personnel file is gone. His service records are incomplete. His whereabouts after December 1945 are unknown. He may have lived a quiet life under an assumed name. He may have been silenced permanently. No one knows. The high-ranking officers who appeared at the crash scene within minutes were never identified. No investigation ever asked who they were, how they knew, why they arrived so quickly. Their presence was noted in witness statements, then ignored. The refusal of an autopsy eliminated any possibility of detecting poison, unusual medications, or foul play.
Beatrice Patton's reasoning was never publicly documented. She returned to Boston with her husband's body and had him buried at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg alongside the soldiers he commanded. Wars don't end when the shooting stops. They end when the victors decide what the victory means. George Patton believed the victory in Europe was incomplete. He saw the strategic failure of allowing Soviet expansion. He understood that defeating fascism while empowering communism wasn't victory. It was tragedy in installments. He wanted to finish the job before the Iron Curtain became permanent. He was dismissed as a warmonger, a reactionary, a dangerous relic of old-fashioned aggression. But history proved him right about everything. The Cold War cost trillions of dollars, millions of lives in proxy conflicts, and 45 years of nuclear terror. Eastern Europe languished under Soviet occupation until 1989. The strategic mistakes Patton identified in 1945 shaped global politics for half a century. And the man who tried to warn America died in a hospital bed, unable to move, 12 days after a truck collision that left everyone else unscathed. Some coincidences are too perfect to believe. The deeper lesson isn't about conspiracy theories or unsolved murders. It's about what happens when truth becomes inconvenient. Patton represented an alternative narrative, a different interpretation of victory, a voice that challenged the official story being constructed by politicians and diplomats. Whether he was murdered or merely unlucky, the outcome was the same: silence. His memoirs were never written. His testimony to Congress never happened. His political career never materialized. The warnings he wanted to deliver were buried with him in Luxembourg soil. History remembers George Patton as a brilliant, flawed, complicated warrior. Pearl-handled revolvers, profanity-laced speeches, slapping incidents, tank columns racing across France, blood and guts and glory. The legend is clean and simple and safely contained in the past. But the messy truth is that Patton saw what was coming, tried to prevent it, and died before he could make anyone listen. Whether assassins killed him or fate betrayed him, the outcome shaped the world we inherited. Eastern Europe fell. The Cold War began. Millions lived and died under totalitarian regimes that Patton wanted to stop in 1945. And every year since, historians have asked the same question. What if Patton had lived? What if he'd made that flight to Boston? What if he'd written those memoirs? What if he'd testified to Congress with the same brutal honesty he brought to battlefields? What if Americans had listened to the general who was right about Stalin when it still mattered?
We'll never know. The truck made sure of that. George Patton is buried in Section A, Plot 1 of the Luxembourg American Cemetery, surrounded by 5,076 American soldiers who died in the European theater. He requested to be buried alongside his men. They granted him that much. Every year, thousands of visitors walk past his grave. They take photographs. They salute. They remember the legend of the warrior general who terrified enemies and inspired armies. But most don't know about the missing reports, the vanished witnesses, the deathbed confession of an OSS assassin, or the questions that still haunt investigators. The official story is simple: tragic accident, blood clot, unlucky end. The truth might be buried in classified archives, locked behind national security classifications that won't expire for another century. Or it might be simpler than conspiracy, just coincidence and misfortune converging on one man who talked too much and threatened too many powerful interests. But this much is certain. George Patton predicted the Cold War before it began. He warned that Stalin would swallow Eastern Europe. He was right about everything. And within hours of that Sunday morning car crash, the machinery of silence began working. Reports disappeared, witnesses vanished, investigations stalled, questions were ignored. And the man who saw the future died before he could change it. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a warrior can do isn't charging an enemy position or leading troops into battle. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is telling the truth when powerful people need lies to survive.
Patton learned that lesson in the back of a 1938 Cadillac on a gray December morning when a 2.5-ton truck turned left at exactly the wrong moment. Or exactly the right one, depending on who you ask. The questions remain. The evidence is incomplete. The witnesses are dead. The truth is buried somewhere between official history and conspiracy theory, in that murky space where facts dissolve into speculation and certainty becomes impossible. What we have left is Patton's legacy. Battles won, armies commanded, warnings unheeded, and a death that may or may not have been the final casualty of World War II. History will never solve this mystery. Too much time has passed, too many secrets were taken to graves. But the questions endure because they matter. They remind us that the stories we're told about heroes and villains, victories and defeats, are constructed narratives shaped by people with agendas. They remind us that sometimes the official version is true, and sometimes it's just the story that powerful people needed to be true. George Patton died on December 21, 1945, at 17:55 hours in a hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. That much is fact. Everything else is mystery, speculation, and the unsettling possibility that somewhere in the shadows of history, someone got away with killing America's most dangerous general. The war claimed him after all, just not on a battlefield where courage mattered. In a hospital room where truth died alongside the man who tried to speak it.